Welcome to the Whole Counsel podcast. I'm John Snyder, and we are still at the beginning of the year, and we are looking at a theme that we started last week. We looked last week at a letter written in January 1778 by John Newton to his friend and fellow preacher who was an older believer named John Berridge, who was a co-worker with George Whitefield many times. And he said to Berridge that it was winter on the outside, gloomy and cold, and it was winter on the inside of his own heart. And he talked about why and, the struggle that he was feeling. And no matter what he could say to others about the beauty of Christ, it seemed to leave Newton unmoved, unaltered, and it bothered him. So he asked his friend to pray for him. Well, this week, we're going to continue to look at the theme of kind of dullness or depression. And we're going to look this week and next week at a small lecture, which has been reprinted as a part of a book called Encouragement for the Depressed. It's a Crossway short classics, and it has a couple of sermons and this lecture by Charles Spurgeon. And so it's a beautiful little book Crossway did, and it's about 1/3 of the book. And if you haven't been listening to Spurgeon sermons, then you can look up in our podcast. And Jeremy Walker is working through those sermons weekly, and I think you'll never be disappointed with Charles Spurgeon. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, Spurgeon makes it clear exactly what he's going to be dealing with. He says, as it is recorded that David in the heat of battle became faint, so may it be written of all the servants of the Lord. Fits of depression come over most of us. Usually, cheerful as we may be, we must at intervals be cast down. The strong are not always vigorous. The wise are not always ready. The brave are not always courageous. And the joyous are not always happy. There may be here and there men of iron, to whom wear and tear work no perceptible detriment, but surely the rust frets even them. And as for ordinary men, the Lord knows and makes known to them that they are but dust. That's a very fancy way of saying that what he's about to talk about is that in the life of the servants of the Lord, and he is going to be applying this to ministers. And as I mentioned, it's part of a series of lectures he gave to young men studying for the ministry. But I think that just everything in this small pamphlet, it doesn't just apply to ministers, but it applies to any believer laboring in the kingdom and at times becoming weary, even to the point of depression at times and dullness. But also I think of Christian parents, especially of older sons and daughters who may at this point be breaking your heart because they are not interested in the Lord that is your life, your love. And you labor to point them to Christ, and it seems to be without effect. And there are times, Spurgeon says, when even people that we think seem to be men or women of iron, even they have seasons of anxiety or depression or extreme sorrow. Now, his approach to this topic, I think, is wise. He doesn't spend a lot of time giving us examples from the lives of the famous saints, some of our favorite biographies. He does mention Martin Luther, and he says this: the life of Martin Luther might suffice to give 1,000 examples, and he was by no means of the weaker sort. His great spirit was often in the seventh heaven of exaltation, and as frequently on the borders of despair. His very deathbed was not free from tempests, and he sobbed himself into his last sleep like a great wearied child. But instead of multiplying cases, let us dwell upon the reasons why these things are permitted, why it is that the children of light sometimes walk in thick darkness, why the heralds of the daybreak find themselves at times in tenfold night. So instead of just giving example after example, he gives something that he feels would be more helpful in this lecture. He explains what are the causes of this that many servants of the Lord find, and he's going to give the cures as well. So what are the causes? And again, dealing with the ministry, and it's applicable to other Christian lives, but he says the first cause is that we are men, or we're mortals, we're human, and therefore we are surrounded with infirmity and full of infirmity, of weaknesses, and we are heirs of sorrow. And he goes on to explain it in this way. Even under the economy of redemption, all right, so even those who are living in the days of the new covenant, it is most clear that we are to endure infirmities. Otherwise, there would be no need of the promised Spirit to help us in the midst of them. It is of need that we are sometimes in heaviness. Good men are promised tribulation in this world, and ministers may expect a larger share than others, that they may learn sympathy with the Lord's suffering people, and so may be fitting shepherds of an ailing flock. So there's a very important point that he brings out. If you are going to be used by the Lord to help others, and it doesn't only apply to a minister, then you must expect that the Lord will to polish you as an instrument, to make you a sharp sword in his hand, to make you effective. He will allow you to go through the sorrows that other people share, and sometimes even greater amounts of sorrow than other people seem to get, so that you can learn compassion and sympathy, so that you're not just a person that's bringing biblical truth to people, but without sympathy, without compassion. He mentions angels. He said angels might have been ordained as evangelists, but their celestial attributes would have disqualified them from having compassion on the ignorant. So, if God would have chosen angels to be his primary means of bringing the gospel to the world, we understand that the angels could have said the truths that God sent them to say perfectly, impressively, but they would have been unfit messengers of the good news to sinners, since they themselves would not understand what it is to live a life like ours, in an environment like ours, with hearts like ours, and they would have no pity or compassion on ignorant humanity. A second thing that he mentions is most of us are in some way or other unsound physically. So that's Spurgeon's way of saying, look, most people that you see, most Christians, especially when they reach, a certain age, have physical problems, and they're having to deal with the physical problems on top of dealing with the spiritual weights. And he says it's not just the physical, like what we think of, aching joints or, weak lungs, whatever we think of when we think of someone getting older. He says there's also, in these mortal bodies, there are also mental illnesses. He calls them mental maladies. And so he mentions this, and he says that this is really even a greater difficulty, and it's prone to drive us to depression more than just the physical, the other physical ways that we have infirmities. So he says this, as to mental maladies, is any man altogether sane? And that's a funny question. Is anyone really, what he's saying is anyone really perfectly mentally healthy? Well, no. And I think the things that Spurgeon says here are way ahead of his time. Without sliding off into the ditch on this side of overreacting to those who are Christian and say, well, there's no such thing as mental illness. If you have strong enough faith, then you get beyond it. And that's one side of the one ditch, and I think that's not accurate. And then the other side of the ditch is that everything's a mental illness, and therefore we're not responsible for our actions or lack of action. And Spurgeon avoids both of those, and which I think is unusual for a man in the late 1800s. But he writes this, are we not all a little off balance? Some minds appear to have a gloomy tinge, essential to their very individuality. This is just their personality, or this is their temperament. They tend to be gloomy. We call them melancholy or depressive personalities. Of them, it may be said, melancholy marked them for her own. So there are some people, he says, that just seem to have a natural propensity toward melancholy. And yet, all of us, whether we are that way or not, will at times suffer the struggle with depression. Now, Spurgeon talks about those that might struggle more with depression, and he says that these infirmities do have benefits under the working of God. So, all things working together for good. He says these infirmities may be no detriment to a man's career of special usefulness. They may even have been imposed upon him by divine wisdom as necessary qualifications for his peculiar course of service. And he says there are some people who seem to go through extra sorrow, and God has chosen this for them because he knows that it will do something in their life that will make them far more effective. And he compares it to plants. He says there are some medicinal plants that grow in, very harsh environments, in the darkness, in swamps. And when we look at the place that they live, we would think that plant will never flourish, but they do flourish, even though they're in difficult places and environments. And as they flourish, they produce leaves or fruit that contain medicinal qualities. And Spurgeon says that's the way it is with us. He even says that pain, he describes pain and sorrow. In some cases, he says, it develops genius. It's like it goes hunting through a soul or through a life of a person, and it locates things in that soul that really rise to the surface only because of the hard times. Otherwise, these extraordinary qualities, this genius, he says, might have slept like a lion in its den undisturbed. Now, Spurgeon goes on to talk about one of the particular difficulties with having mental maladies or struggles with perhaps mental illness at times, or extraordinary seasons of depression, which Spurgeon definitely had. He said one of the problems with this is that you can't see it on the outside. If a person had, a bad leg, if a person had a withered up arm, if a person had lost an eye, if a person couldn't hear, they were deaf, these physical things, you recognize that they have this problem externally. You can kind of see from their behavior, oh, you have that. And you make allowances for them. You don't get frustrated with a person with a bad leg if they don't run or walk as quickly as someone else. But a person with mental struggles, with mental illnesses, Spurgeon says, these can't be seen. They're invisible to the eye. And so the lack of perhaps in seasons of depression, the lack of productivity and the struggle just to get up and get going, Spurgeon says it's not understood because you don't see anything on the outside that would explain it. And so people can often misjudge or judge harshly. And Spurgeon encourages believers to be gentle in their judgment of those that struggle with seasons of depression, because the Lord will use it in the kingdom. And he says all of us are weak, and all of us do go through times, no matter how cheerful our disposition may be. We may be more of a sanguine kind of person. But he says it doesn't matter. If you're laboring in the kingdom, there will be seasons where sorrows will come to such a degree, or, so rapidly, one following on the next, that even the most cheerful person enters into a season of depression at times. So he says, we have the treasure of the gospel in earthen vessels. And if there be a flaw in the vessel here and there, let no one wonder. Now, another reason, Spurgeon said, that the servants of the Lord, particularly ministers, are often tempted to depression is because their work, not just because they're human, and they have limitations physically and, problems physically and mentally at times. He says, but also the nature of our work. So what kind of servants we are? Well, we are human, living in a flawed world. What kind of work or task are we called to do? He says, our work, when earnestly undertaken, lays us open to attacks in the direction of depression. Spurgeon writes, who can bear the weight of souls without sometimes sinking to the dust? Passionate longings after men's conversion, if not fully satisfied, and when are they? Consume the soul with anxiety and disappointment. To see the hopeful turn aside, a person, he's speaking of a person that you think you're very hopeful that they're really following the Lord now, and they just turn aside. To see the godly grow cold, to see professing Christians abusing their privileges, and sinners waxing more bold in their sin. Are not these sights enough to crush us to the earth? The kingdom, he says, comes not as we wish it would. The reverend name is not hallowed as we would desire it to be, and for this we weep. How can we be otherwise than sorrowful while men will not believe our report and the divine arm is not revealed? All mental work, he goes on to say, tends to weary and to depress. For much study is weariness to the flesh, but ours is more than mental work. It is heart work, the labor of our inmost soul. How often on the Lord's Day evenings, so after Sunday evening, do we feel as if life were completely washed out of us? And again, it's not just the minister that can feel this. I think of parents who pour themselves out and, perhaps on the holiday season, you spent time with unbelieving family members and you prayed as you approached it and you looked for opportunities and you spoke. And it, sometimes when you're in that kind of a situation, it can feel like a spiritual tug of war constantly. Even as you're just sitting and having casual conversation with lost family members, you're praying and wrestling really with the Lord that he would create an opening. And when you have that chance, and then, to risk the friendships with family members, to tell them of Christ again when they have already expressed a lack of interest. And so you can feel just completely washed out. But Spurgeon says, we don't have any right to complain because, he says, we are not to be living specimens of men in fine preservation. We're not beautiful teacups, beautiful china that, that's put in the cabinets and protected and it's admired. He says, no, we are living sacrifices whose lot is to be consumed. We are to spend and to be spent. Another reason he says that depression can often strike a minister is the position they hold in the church. And Spurgeon basically argues this way. A minister, he says, is called to labor among his people, but oftentimes the nature of that relationship results in the fact that the minister feels isolated. Even though he's among the people serving the people, he can be isolated from the people. And even though they may love him and they want to know how they can help him, there are times, Spurgeon says, where they just can't. They can't really enter into the sorrows that he carries. They can't walk shoulder to shoulder with him in a way that where they really enter into that sorrow. They really understand the burden. And so they say things that are kind. They pray for him. They look for ways to be helpful. But Spurgeon says there are seasons in the minister's life where the folks, they just can't understand. And the pastors as leaders are somewhat isolated. And so he says sometimes he feels that a minister can be similar to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, who looked to his disciples for sympathy, for fellow feeling with him as he agonized at that moment, and for them to pray alongside with him, but they're asleep. And he says the preacher can sometimes look to the believers in the church and look for them to come alongside of him, and it's maybe not their fault at all, or maybe they're apathetic, but for whatever reason, they aren't able to or aren't willing to do that. They don't even notice, perhaps, the burden he's carrying at that moment. And so he says, you feel even more lonely at the end of that because you've looked to your closest friends that you work among, and even they can't help. And so it just feels as if everything isolates you. And he writes, this loneliness, which, if I mistake not, is felt by many of my brothers, is a fertile source of depression. And our ministers' fraternal meeting and the cultivation of holy intercourse with kindred minds will, with God's blessing, help us greatly to escape that snare. So he doesn't just say, well, that's just the way it is. But he says to the ministers, with that in mind, and how often that sense of isolation, maybe, again, no fault of the church, but that feeling of separateness and aloneness in times of great sorrow, he says, knowing that is the case, then you should not neglect ministers' fraternals. So meet with other ministers. Open the heart to other ministers. You can think of the letter that we read last week where John Newton opens his heart to an older preacher, John Barrage. Cultivate holy conversation with kindred minds, with men who think like you think about Christ. And he says, and with God's blessing, that will help us greatly to escape that snare. That brings us to the last thing for this podcast, and this brings us about halfway through his lecture, and that is, he says, there is another cause of depression. And he says, it's the way that we neglect our bodies as ministers. And he warns men that sedentary lifestyles where you're sitting poring over a book for hours on end, or just meeting and talking with people and, being in your study and it's kind of gloomy in there, and, you're not out in nature, you're not out breathing in the sea air. Londoners always talked about going to the sea and getting seaside air. You're not in a healthy environment. You're not getting out and walking in the woods, he says. And so this sedentary life, it does have an impact on us, and it does often produce, he says, a kind of a depressive personality. And he actually quotes a writer from his day, a man named Robert Burton, who wrote a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy. Interesting. And so Spurgeon quotes him, and this is what this man points out. Students are negligent of their bodies. Other men look to their tools. A painter will wash his pencils. A smith will look to his hammer, anvil, forge. A husbandman will mend his plow irons, he's a farmer, and grind his hatchet if it be dull. A falconer or a huntsman will have an especial care of his hawks, his hounds, his horses, his dogs, etc. A musician will string and unstring his instruments. Only scholars neglect that instrument, their brain, their spirits, their soul, he says, which they daily use. He writes, to sit long in one posture, poring over a book or driving a quill, in other words, writing, we would say hammering away at your computer keys, is in itself a taxing thing. But add to this a badly ventilated chamber, a body that has long been without any exercise, and a heart burdened with many cares, and we have all the elements for preparing a seething cauldron of despair, especially in the dim months of fog, in other words, the winter season. Interesting. So the physical effects, the emotional effects, the mental health effects of a sedentary life where you're stuck in a room and you don't get out. So Spurgeon gives some advice. Let a man be naturally as blithe as a bird, he says. He will hardly be able to bear up year after year against such a suicidal process, as was just mentioned, sitting in rooms and just poring over books. He will make his study a prison and his books the wardens of a jail. You ever feel that way? I find myself feeling that way, where I walk by my study, and the church here has built me a really nice study. And I look in there, and I remember days where I would look at that study and I'd be excited. I mean, it's so nice. It's bookshelves, floor to ceiling, down. It's got the ladder on the rail that slides down so that I can reach the shelves up top. It's idyllic. And most of my minister friends who come visit me look at it, and then they kind of roll their eyes at me like, man, you're spoiled. And I know I am. But when times of depression come on a minister, if he's not careful and he's neglecting his mind and his mental health and his physical health, Spurgeon says your study can become a prison and your books are just your wardens. And he says, this can be the case while nature, creation, lies outside his window, calling him to health and beckoning him to joy. So Spurgeon basically gives this advice before he moves on to the next point, that we ought to get outside, he says. Get out and breathe the air. Walk through the woods. Look at the creation of God. Walk under the stars. Get your heart, get your mind out of that little constraining room that you have to be in so often because of your work. And he writes it this way: a day's breathing of fresh air on the hills, or a few hours ramble in the beech woods, calm, would sweep the cobwebs out of the brains of scores of our toiling ministers who are now but half alive. A mouthful of sea air or a stiff walk in the wind's face would not give grace to your soul, but it would yield oxygen to the body, which is the next best thing. So he's not saying that going for long nature walks is going to make you more godly. He said, but it'll get oxygen, it'll get your blood pumping. And he says, that's the next best thing. Then he closes this main point before he moves on to another reason for fainting fits or fits of depression among ministers. He closes it by saying this: for lack of opportunity, you're too busy, or inclination, you don't really want to. So for lack of opportunity to going out into nature, or for a lack of inclination, I don't really want to get up and go for a walk right now. He says these great remedies are neglected, and the student becomes a self-immolated victim. So he ends up being his worst enemy. He neglects the things that would help him, and despair sets in, and he's a victim of his own poor choices. Well, next week, we'll pick back up with the second half of Spurgeon's the minister's fainting fits. And as I mentioned last week, we are running a new sale on the first and second Behold Your God studies and the children's material that was made from them. And it might be that you might find those helpful to stir your heart as well. And so you can go and check out the website for those. Next week, the second half of Spurgeon's explanation of the causes and the cure of depression, especially among ministers.